What if you could legally reduce your taxes to zero? Would you? Should you? Well, many Christians struggle with the spiritual, civic, and ethics of paying taxes, especially to support government spending they might not agree with. In this episode of the Christian Capitalist Show, I take on this taxing topic and extract brilliant deductions from Christian CPA James Bohan. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Christian Capitalist Show. I am your host, Russell Gray, and I am excited to be sharing with you a very good buddy of mine now, CPA James Bohan. James, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Russell. Excited to be a part about this new show.
Yeah, I'm excited. I've got some notes here in front of me, so I'm going to pull them up here where I can see them a little bit. But James, why don't you take a moment and just fill the folks in a little bit? I call you a Christian CPA and a Main Street capitalist. You're obviously running your own business. You got your hands in some other pots, but just give the folks a little bit of an idea of who you are, where you come from, what you're doing today, and what your professional expertise is.
Will do. So I started my career as a CPA for Wall Street, for lack of a better word. I came from a real estate family and I worked for a firm that specialized for hedge funds, private equity funds. And given my background, I really slotted into the real estate fund division of this company. And this was around 2009, 2010, a little bit before the Jobs Act came through and really democratized crowdfunding and syndicators for real estate. So I cut my teeth really learning about how these billion-dollar funds would go out, buy real estate, and create these investment vehicles for real estate as an asset class that I knew so well growing up with developers and seeing how kind of Wall Street or the syndicators took approach to investing in real estate. I did that for about 5 years. My firm got bought by KPMG. And around that time, I went back to USC to get my master's in real estate development. Graduated in the top 5% of my class there, got hired by one of my professors to go help start a real estate lending debt fund. And so I was able to really channel this inner entrepreneur, but for someone else for a few years to help build out this debt fund. We brought over 1,400 LPs on board while I was there. We did over $1 billion of loans while I became CFO after being the first employee. And then after about 4 years there, I left because while I felt like an entrepreneur, I had no entrepreneurial upside. So my boss was very gracious. He's like, I've had these things come up in my career. We're never going to be able to pay you as much as you value yourself in the mirror. So, I think we best part ways. And I agreed. And I went off and started my own CPA firm. I started doing some real estate investments. That was around 2019. And then COVID hit and I was working remotely already. So I just picked up my shop and moved from Los Angeles to Idaho, which has, a much more freer economy than California. And I've met a lot of awesome kind of Main Street, freedom-minded individuals up here in Idaho, and have helped start a few small businesses. I live on a farm. I started a farmer's market, and I've been investing in developing real estate around North Idaho, along with growing my CPA practice, where I really help a lot of real estate investors, entrepreneurs, syndicators, fund managers navigate the really complicated IRS code, and then also the complications around setting up, administering, and running a real estate fund.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we met at a real estate conference. We were at the Best Ever conference and we went to a dinner. You were sitting across from me and I was doing like I typically do. I was running my mouth and talking about a bunch of stuff. And you just sat there quietly and listened and said, I think we probably have a lot in common. And so I contacted you afterwards, and of course we've become friends. And I continue to learn about you and your background. But I know you're the perfect guy for this program, so I'm really excited to have you here.
Yeah, it was funny at that dinner. I felt like I was sitting across the table from one of my political idols, Ron Paul, who I was a big fan of when he was running in the early 2010s, and it was just a lovely conversation talking about the free market, the banking system, and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's been a passion of mine. I got started in this whole space, as I think because I read G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, when I was in the middle of homeschooling with my late wife, my then, grade school, middle school children. And part of my responsibility was teaching history, American history, civics, and economics. And as I was doing the research, we didn't have YouTube and the internet back then because I'm an old man. And so, my kids grew up before we had all that, which was actually kind of nice from a parent's perspective. I didn't have to deal with it. But, I used to have to go to the conferences and peruse all the books in the exhibitor hall and pick out things. And as I started reading, I realized, wow, there was so much that got left out of my public education. I had no idea. And then one day I realized that our financial system was really, I don't know, I think corrupt, for lack of a better word. The scripture, the borrower is servant to the lender, really resonated with me when I looked at our financial system. And I realized the whole system is designed to put the citizenry into debt. And the income tax system is the way that debt is serviced. And so if you go back and research the history, as I know you're familiar with it, of the Federal Reserve Act, the 16th Amendment, when we got the IRS, we got the tax code, we got the income tax, all of that stuff happened. The Federal Reserve was born out of that central bank. We didn't have a central bank. It was our third. And that's a whole article or a whole new episode. But the point of that is that I realized that my kids were going to grow up into this system of mandatory tribute, a feudal system. And so I thought, well, I need to get into financial education to begin to wake people up. And I've been on that journey for the last 30 years. I think it's kind of coming to a head right now, and I'm excited about that. But until the system changes, we have the system that we have. And part of that system is, I think, Title 26, I believe it is, the income tax. And that's probably one of the biggest burdens on most people on Main Street, whether you're a small business or an employee. So what I wanted to talk about here was things that I think a lot of Christians struggle with. First of all, it's just the faith, the spiritual command to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And then the other part of it is the ethics of being forced to pay money into a system that's doing things that you might not agree with and wish that you weren't funding. And then the civic duty of having responsibility to the community to support the common infrastructure the community needs, which ostensibly is the reason that we pay taxes. And then the stewardship responsibility. So I want to hit all those kind of in order. So let's just start with the faith thing. I mean, you're a Christian man, you're a Christian capitalist, you've earned money, now you counsel people. When it comes down to just dealing with the spirituality and the Christian imperative, if you will, to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, what are your thoughts on that?
I'll take that direct quote kind of as a starting point here, where it says, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's," and Jesus says, "And to God what is God's." What is interesting about that is when they talked about that back in the day on the denarius or the coin, they had an image of Caesar there. So the coin has Caesar's image on it. So render that to Caesar. And what are we? Have our image? We're made in the image of God, so we render ourselves to God, but the money to the government in a way. And I always like to take this quote and say, "Render what to Caesar, which is due to Caesar." But now let's argue about what's actually due to him, because now Caesar has set up these awesome rules of laws where there's only one that says you have to pay tax, but then there's thousands that say, well, unless you do this, or unless you do that, or unless you structure it this way. So it's my job to kind of take what Caesar has put out there, the government, and navigate the channels to still, be good Christians and render to Caesar what is due to him. I'm just going to, do my job and really dig into the weeds and argue down what to pay Caesar.
It's interesting because I have a friend who says that the tax code is a roadmap so that to not paying taxes, because it tells you where the government wants you to put your money. And when you do that, they reward you by not taxing you. And I like that. But I do want to address, because I do have friends and I've gotten into heated conversations with people. As a business person, I think it's a natural desire to reduce your expenses, and taxes and expense. But there are people out there, and maybe some listening to this program right now, that are Christians, and they have this feeling that taxes are a moral imperative, and it's to use a deduction is to use a loophole to game the system and somehow get out of something you're morally obligated to. Have you ever dealt with anybody like that? Have you ever struggled with that yourself? Would you agree with that statement? I already know the answer. Or, how do you deal with that part of it?
The most people I argue with about that fight are LinkedIn trolls that comment on my taxation is theft kind of posts out there. But because I take the complete opposite end, in that It is your moral responsibility to pay as little in taxes as legally possible. You know, the
And,
whole,
I'm sure you know, there's a Supreme Court ruling that says exactly that.
yeah. Yeah, and it goes back to, like you said, the IRS was founded in 1913, around the same time we got the Federal Reserve, because they had to find a way to cover the debt service through taxes. And then also above and beyond that, the government just spends so much money frivolously. There's, just so much waste there. And then they're oftentimes funding things with your tax dollars that are very anti-Christian or anti things that you believe in. Growing up in the 2000s, I was very anti-war. I never wanted my money to go support the war. They were spending a lot of money on abortions and just so many things that are anti-Christian and anti-freedom minded that I don't want my life effort going to fund these things. If you think about money as a form of energy, or really it's just a form of time, time and effort gets transmuted into this thing called money. And, time and effort can be also described as life force. And, I don't want my life force going to fund things that I find inherently evil or inherently anti-Christian. You know, that's not to say that I think all taxes are bad. So, I live in Idaho, where we have, a modest about 5% tax rate, and the government usually runs a surplus. They're not teaching woke garbage in the schools. And what? They're actually doing kind of a decent job of running the state. And so I don't actually mind paying a small amount of state taxes. This is kind of how our government was set up back originally, where each states had their different power to run the way they wanted to run. And so to me, state taxes aren't as bad as federal taxes. Now, if you live in California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, Washington, Oregon, I'm going to have a different answer. But where I sit right now, I don't mind paying a little bit of state taxes. Taxes are people's biggest expense in life. And when they take your money to fund things that are inherently evil to you or anti-Christian, they're not just taking your money, they're taking away the time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears that you put into making that money. And essentially, that's another word for life force. Money is a store of this time value of effort that you put out there. And to me, having my life force go to fund these evil things like war or abortion, or so many other just different anti-Christian endeavors, the large welfare, EBT, whole system was just very antithetical to my, free values and Christian values. And so it's been my life mission to figure out how to limit, paying taxes as much as possible. So my life force is not funding these evil and anti-Christian things. The federal government is one of the biggest perpetrators of this. Governments all across the world in history have been the perpetrators of the most evil, the most mass death, the most mass murder. And so it's been my life mission to, not pay taxes myself. And now as a CPA, help people, not pay taxes legally with the tax code. Now, as I was getting into before, I live in Idaho, and Idaho has a moderate, 5% tax. And I honestly don't mind paying my state taxes because I actually see the benefit for it. They're not wasting my money on evil things. They're actually running the state quite well, which is kind of how the founders envisioned the country, for the states to really have a lot more power and taxing authority to be able to run things the way they want. Now, if I sat in California, Oregon, Washington, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, I'd have a much different feeling about state taxes. But within America, we could always pick up and move across borders like I did about 5 years ago.
Yeah, well, obviously that's an argument for keeping states independent and not having a gigantic federal overlay. And I think that was the original intention of the founders. One thing I try to do is deal with policy over politics. And when I do a policy analysis, I just try to decide what is and have less of a debate about what should be. And in this particular case, I think I'm in the same camp as you. I'm not a big fan of paying for a bloated government. I'm not a big fan of being forced to support things I don't believe in. I would like to have more discretion. I don't believe property taxes are moral. I don't see how you can be said to be sovereign and be able to own property if you have to pay rent. I understand having to fund government and pay for services, but that can be done on a vendor basis. Most of it can be done privately. But that's all nice if somebody was going to make me God for a day and I could rearrange the government to my liking, but that's not the way it is. So it's fine when we're discussing policy and we're going to elect policy makers and decide what policies we're going to support. But right now we have an income tax, we have property taxes, we have sales taxes, we have excise taxes of all types. If you really put it all in a blender and hit puree and get down to a bottom line, I mean, even the least taxed among us are paying probably well into double digits, and the most taxed among us probably well over 50%. So the serfs in feudal England actually had it better than we do. But again, we can't change that. So the goal here is to first wrestle with the idea of whether or not you should put in the effort to try to reduce your taxes. So I wanted to start with the faith and a bit on the ethics. I got a scripture here I want to read. This is Matthew 17:24 to 27. And this is Peter and Jesus, and they're talking. It says, when they had come to Capernaum, those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, does your teacher not pay the temple tax? And he said, yes. And this is Peter responding. And when he had come into the house, Jesus anticipated him, probably heard the whole thing, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers? And Peter said to him, from strangers. Then Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, take the fish that comes up first, and when you've opened its mouth, you'll find a piece of money. Take that and give it to them for me and you. So Jesus was basically saying, hey, you're not obligated to pay the tax, but lest we offend them, just go do what you know how to do. You're a fisherman, go down and fish, pull out a piece of money and pay the tax and get it over with. So I just give that to people. They can interpret it. I'm not a preacher. I'm not here to tell people what God's, meaning when he's saying that. I'm just saying this is what the Bible says. But based on that, now we've got through say, okay, if we can get to the place where we feel like we don't have a spiritual mandate or a moral obligation to pay taxes beyond what the law requires, then our civic duty is to be supportive of the communities we live in. And then our responsibility to our families, to our investors, if we are a fiduciary, if you will, running a fund or sitting in the role of a management of a company where you have shareholders, you have a responsibility to improve the bottom line. So we've got the tax code, which you alluded to earlier, which gives you a lot of things that you can actually do to bring your taxes down. So let's just say for a moment, our goal is to bring our taxes down to zero or as close to zero as we can get them, meaning that if we do want to pay for something inside or outside the government, we have reduced the burden of taxes that we don't want to pay, mandatory taxes, and we make the whole thing optional for ourselves. So when you think about tax strategies, let's just start with a typical employee. And I know you and I both know that that's probably the hardest position to play from. But what are some tax mitigation strategies that people who are employees can begin to put in place?
As you mentioned before, maybe the tax code is really just a set of policies, and the tax code is set to incentivize certain behaviors. And that's why being a W-2 or employee gives you so few options on how to limit your tax liability, because you're not creating a larger enterprise where you're employing people and adding more value to the economy. You're definitely adding value to your employer, but in the grander scope of how the tax system and incentives are set up, you're not doing what the government wants you to do, so they're going to tax you the highest between payroll taxes, income taxes. Now, that being said, there's a few strategies you can do. Itemized deductions start to become your friend as a W-2 employee, and that really means income taxes, home mortgage, and charity, are kind of your itemized deduction lane there. Now, above and beyond that, you can start a side hustle. And whether that's through an S corporation or a partnership or a sole proprietorship that would get reported on your Schedule C, which is the highest risk, you can start to deduct things that you maybe couldn't deduct before. So things that are incidental to the business, like using your cell phone to process orders for your side hustle outside your W-2 job. Now you can start to deduct your cell phone. If you use a laptop, now you can start to deduct your laptop. You can start to deduct a home office. It's when you start a side hustle, you're really now a small business owner. And the whole, world of the tax code starts to open up to you to start to be able to take deductions against the income from your, business that your side hustle, you're a business owner of now.
Yeah, you had mentioned high risk being sole proprietorship, and that's, of course, from a tax perspective and getting audited, I believe is what you're saying. But it's also an exposure from a legal liability. I know you're not an attorney, neither am I, but it's my understanding, and I'm sure yours too, that when you don't have that corporate veil, you don't have that limited liability of a limited liability company or the corporate veil of a corporation. The acts of being in business and any liabilities created by the business come right home to roost on you. So there's both a tax and legal reason why it makes a lot of sense to use an entity. And then it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that if you were to use, for example, a C corporation, there's some disadvantages, which of course is that the income accrues in there, and if you pull it out, you get double taxed. But you can also write off a ton of stuff. And so if you don't have a highly profitable business, what are your thoughts on setting up a C corporation to maximize those deductions and benefits?
I see C corporation used in a few areas. So C corporations have this great qualified small business stock, QSBS, part of the tax code where if you start a business and your goal is to sell it, you can exclude up to $10 million of capital gains or 10x your basis if it's in a C Corp. So that's one of the number ones I see for it. Two is when someone's like in a 37 or 39% tax bracket. Sometimes we can use a C Corp to do some income shifting and leave some money in. So if they're 37 over here personally, but they're 21% at the C Corp and don't have to pull the money out for double taxation on the dividends, that's another structure. And then thirdly, one of the reasons why I use it, and what I see a lot of family offices use it for, is that reimbursements for things like medical coming out of a C Corp are deductible by the C corporation and not included in income in the individual. Now that's different compared to partnership or S corporation land. So those are kind of the main reasons why I see C corporations used.
Yeah, and if you got a home office and you have to go out from your home office, that's not a commute. That's travel expense, makes your car a potential deduction, as I understand it. Obviously, if you're a Uber driver or doing any type of ride share, there's probably some deductions there. So we're not here to give you tax advice. I'm certainly not. James maybe could, but unless you've engaged him, it's not actionable advice. It's just ideas and information for you. But the point of it is, if you're an employee, for a couple different reasons. One is for the upside potential, and the other is for the opportunity to pick up some real tax deductions. You might think about setting up some kind of a side hustle. And then you mentioned charitable giving. And you and I are working on something very specific, kind of a high-end strategy for high net worth people to create big tax deductions just by shifting equity from a highly appreciated asset into a charity. We're not going to talk about that today, but if you're interested in that, then you can send an email. I'm going to call it endowment because that's, I think that's the best way to do it, but let's just call it endowment at thechristiancapitalist.com. And then you'll be on the list when we produce that piece of content. We'll get it out to you and you can take a look at it. It's a great way for you to pick up a really double dip on the tax deduction and put your equity to work in a ministry or some type of a charity that you really believe in. So I'll just leave that there for now. But now let's talk about somebody that's actually a small business owner. The world opens up quite a bit when you get out from underneath that W-2 and you're full-blown business owner. What are some tax strategies small business owners, what I call Main Street capitalists, can employ?
Great question there. So we'll leave kind of real estate outside of this because I think real estate is one of the best avenues for tax write-offs, but not everyone's in real estate. And a lot of people are small business owners. So like I said before, entity structuring is one of the first things to look at. Maybe a C corporation works for you, but maybe not. And maybe you're probably better off suited by an S corporation. Most small businesses can take advantage of saving some payroll taxes and self-employment taxes by using an S corporation. And then that's kind of the entity structuring side. And then now we kind of get into the tax deduction side of the world and, accelerating expenses, as we're getting into Q4 here, 2025, if business owners had a really good year, have a lot of surplus cash, they can maybe look into 2026 and be like, hey, I'm going to spend about, 30K in marketing, or I'm going to be going to these conferences. Can I pay that now as a cash basis taxpayer in 2025 and kind of accelerate the deduction for when it's going to be used in 2026? And that can be anything from equipment purchases, like I said, to the advertising. And then you kind of got to get into the tax credit land. So before we said, let's do the entity structuring. Now let's reduce our taxable income. Now that we have this ending taxable income here, what kind of maybe potential tax credits can I generate? There used to be a lot of solar and renewable energy ones that are sunsetting. There's a whole list of tax credits out there. For my real estate guys, you can do ADA redevelopments on your properties to get about $5,000 of credits a year. So those are kind of like high level strategies on how to do that. Also for small business owners, you can hire your kids, make sure they're really justifiably doing work for the business and you're paying them a market rate before you would pay someone else. But those are kind of the things we look through when we work with clients on tax advisory and tax strategy. We send them a long questionnaire being like, hey, where are you spending money? Are you supporting any relatives? Not just your kids, but let's say you have an aunt or a grandma who you put up in a condo. Well, maybe that aunt or grandma can help process payroll, once a month, and then you pay her now, and then she rents from you, and now you've unlocked depreciation on the condo that otherwise you were just giving to her for free. So, taking the facts and circumstances of your life and then trying to change how you do some certain things into a more favorable tax result is a lot of the planning we do with our clients and suggestions we make.
Okay, so I speak both Main Street and tax a little bit, right? I'm going to interpret some of what you just said.
Right.
You talked about tax credits and tax deductions, and so those are different. So why don't you just explain that? Because they sound the same to the layperson, but they're very different.
They're very different. So a tax deduction, let's say you make $100,000 in revenue, but you have $50,000 of expenses. Generally speaking, expenses means deductions. There's some other potential deductions as well that may not exactly be expenses, such as like a HSA contribution. You can deduct that from your taxable income. But when we're talking about deductions, it's lowering your taxable income. Now, when we're talking about tax credits, is let's say you have that $50,000, net income and you owe maybe $10,000 taxes on that. If you invest in something that generates a tax credit of say $5,000, or like an EV credit of $7,500, you apply that credit towards that 10 grand you owe and reduce what you owe there. So you get a credit against your taxes owed versus a deduction on income. So I think that's kind of the nuance there. And that was a great point for you to call out for us.
Yeah. Just to be clear again for everybody, you got the $100,000 of taxable income or gross income. You deduct $50,000 of expenses. So your income, your taxable income is now $50,000. And if you're in, say, a 40% tax bracket, you're going to pay $20,000.
Yep.
Okay. Now, let's say that you owe $40,000 and you make an investment and it gives you $10,000 of tax credits. It doesn't reduce the $100,000 to $90,000. It reduces the $40,000 tax to $30,000 because it's applied directly. A tax credit is applied directly to the tax bill, whereas a tax deduction just reduces the amount the tax rate is applied to. Did I say that correctly?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. So I want to make sure people are clear on that. The other thing you talked about was hiring children, and this is near and dear to my heart. I had a lot of children. I believe one of the fundamental issues we have in our society is the result of organizing the economics of our society around making children a liability and not an asset. For so many years in humanity, the more children you had, the richer you were. They fed the chickens, they milked the cows, they worked in the family shop. They were being apprenticed in being productive human beings. They understood what it was to work, to be productive. They knew if they didn't get up and do their chores, there wasn't food that evening. There was some really good things that happened when kids were working. We moved into the industrial age, and now all of a sudden, the children are in factories, and to protect them, child labor laws were put in place. And I think that was okay for a season, but the side effect, whether it was intended or unintended, is that we've conditioned children. We've made children a liability, number one, so parents don't want to have them, and now we have a demographic problem. Number two is we're training the children that everything they need should just be provided for them by right. And so they grow up expecting the government to take over for mom and dad and just take care of them. And so that's a mentality. So I created the Raising Capitalists Foundation specifically around changing that. I don't think we're going to be able to go into the school system and change the culture or the motivation of the school system. And I don't think children are going to learn economics and productivity and the difference between capitalism and socialism and communism in a school book. I think they're going to learn it in the real world. And so how do you get kids into the productive economy? Parents start a side hustle. Parents employ their children. And the way it works is that, let's say, James, you are my business mentor in the Raising Capitalists mentoring program, and you're an entrepreneur. And I'm a parent, and I don't know anything about starting a business, but I joined the program to get mentored, and you teach me how to set up an LLC, how to set up the structure, and then I begin to provide services to you. And so let's just say you pay me $14,000, or maybe no, just call it 13,000 because we know that fits, right? So you pay me $13,000, and I turn around and have my children do $13,000 worth of work. You deduct 13. I deduct the 13, and the child doesn't have to pay any tax. So I've created virtually tax-free all the way down the chain. Plus, I've got the kid involved in the business. Am I correct in my understanding that that's the way that works?
Yeah, that's another idea of income shifting. When you look at a family as a whole economic unit, shifting income to a higher taxpayer at 37% to a kid, pay them below the standard deduction, they pay zero. And so that's just another idea of moving tax rates around and really thinking of the family as a total economic unit versus just siloed off one by one.
Yeah. And so when I was in the 8th grade, I was taking algebra. And if I could do algebra in the 8th grade, I could probably underwrite an apartment building. I could, yeah. Right? So there are legit things that children, middle schoolers, can do. Social media, doing research on AI. It doesn't have to be menial tasks like filing and shredding documents, although those things are fine too. Taking out the trash are all valuable. But now you realize that you can create a lot of family tax-free income simply by having children engaged in your business. And now the more children you have, the less taxes you pay, and you're training them to get used to not paying tax, so that when they go out in the real world and get their first job, they're like, well, how come they told me I got paid $1,000 and I'm only getting paid $700. What happened to that other 30%? What am I getting for that money? And so if you're interested in learning more about that, you can visit the raisingcapitalists.org website or send an email to raisingcapitalists@thechristiancapitalist.com. We'll get you information about that. But it's a nonprofit foundation I set up specifically to teach parents how to do this, because it's part of healing, I think, and bringing capitalism back to Main Street. Okay, so those are some strategies. Let's go into the real estate side of things. That's near and dear to my heart. For 20 years, I was the co-host of the Real Estate Guys radio show, and we were an investment talk program. And I spent a lot of time as the financial strategist helping people understand how to use real estate as a financial vehicle. It allows you to short the dollar with debt. It allows you to pick up now depreciation schedules. And, when Donald Trump leaned into the microphone in the 2016 presidential campaign, and he was being accused of not paying taxes, and they said it was because he was a thief. He goes, no, it's because I'm smart. And they fought back and forth about getting into his tax returns. They went through them with a fine-tooth comb and couldn't find anything because he was legally paying no tax, and primarily because he was using real estate. So you can take advantage of that to a degree, even if you're an employee, but it's a lot easier if you're a business, especially if you're a full-time investor. So James, walk people who aren't familiar with all of that, how that works.
So yeah, this is a really detailed and nuanced kind of area, but I'll speak really high level here. So with real estate, when you buy an asset, let's say you spend $1 million, um, there are different components that the IRS says you bought. So there's the land, there's the building, and generally there's a safe harbor of 20% land, 80% building allocation. So $1 million purchase, I have an $800,000 building, and that's an asset for me. I own this building, but the tax code lets you write off a portion of that building every year, and that's called depreciation, and it's generally about 30 years. So doing the math right now, without doing anything special, you can start to write off about $26,000 a year just for having this asset. And that's called depreciation. It's a phantom expense. When we say phantom in the tax world, it's either income or expense without actually cash coming through. So your building's going to be spitting off cash flow, but you're going to be taking this non-tax cash deduction against that cash flow. So what we get what's called depreciation sheltered cash flows, where you might be getting, $10,000 a month in cash, but you're only paying tax on, say, $5,000 of it. Now there's more advanced sections of the tax code where we can look and say that $800,000 building is actually comprised of, there's $100,000 of land improvements, there's, $200,000 of specialty equipment. Think about like this whole cost segregation is what I'm describing thing came about with hospitals. Think about buying a hospital building. There's so much specialty electronics and equipment in the walls that really doesn't get depreciated over 30 to 40 years. And you can start to accelerate that depreciation through something called bonus depreciation, where you can write off all that specially identified equipment or components of a building in the first year. So you're really able to juice a lot of these deductions through real estate in the year of acquisition when you're buying these things. So those are kind of like the first tier of great benefits of investing in real estate. Then you get to other tax benefits, such as being able to exchange your property tax-free under a 1031 exchange. So if your $1 million building goes up to $2 million, you can go buy another $2 million building, sell the first one, and get it tax-free with a 1031 exchange. And then lastly, similar example, your building value goes up to $2 million. You can take a loan against that, cash out $1.5 million, put it in your pocket, pay back the old loan, pocket the difference, and that's all tax-free as well. So there's a lot of tax benefits of owning real estate. And depending on how active you are into it, the deductions can really magnify, or they can even be, if you're just a small person, you can deduct about $25,000 a year from your real estate.
It's interesting because none of this, if you're out there and listening to this and your head is spinning, just hang in there with us, because it's important. If you make a lot of money and pay a lot of tax, you really want to pay attention, especially if you don't like what the government is doing with your taxes and you want to take control back. And that's kind of the theme here. If you don't make a lot of money yet, but you plan to, this is stuff you're going to need to know. And you want to put it into practice as soon as you can once you start making money, because why pay any more than you need to? What my journey on this started when when I first started out in my life, I just thought if I could ever make $50,000 a year, I'd be set for life. Why would I ever want to make any more? It was the early 1980s, and that was a lot of money. I thought, man, 50,000. A few years later, I was paying $50,000 a year in tax, and I thought, gosh, this is weird. I used to think that was a full-time job. It's probably worth my time to really learn how to mitigate that tax bill. And that set me down this whole path. I got, interested in a lot of things, but where I ultimately landed was recognizing that owning a business and being in real estate was the way to go. And especially if you used debt creatively, you could create giant phantom deductions, keep real estate equity moving, and never have it be diminished by taxes. And as a financial strategist, I would compare that to what goes on in the stock market. So let's talk about that, because a lot of people who are listening, when they compare real estate, for example, to the stock market, they'll do something very simplistic. They'll say, well, stocks have gone up an average of 8% a year, or whatever the number is, for the last 30, 40 years, and real estate's only gone up 6%. And if you're out there and you've done that, heard that, and decided that stocks are a better way to go, I encourage you get involved in our investor mentoring club where we go deeper into these things. It's a premium program, but I think it's well worth it. It's not expensive. Where you have a chance to ask questions and dig into these things. But when you add in leverage and tax breaks, there's no comparison. So you've explained a little bit about real estate, even though I know it was hard for some people to follow, but we'll break that down in some math at some point in a future episode, or maybe in one of the sessions in the Investor Mentoring Club. But talk a little bit about just the person who's out there day trading stocks. They're buying low, sell high, buy low, sell high, buy low, sell high. They're churning the portfolio. I'm not going to call it gambling. You could make the argument that it is, but I'm not going to pass moral judgment on it, or whether it's a productive activity. Is it adding anything to the economy? Are you creating any goods and services? I'm going to leave that alone. I have my opinion. But with that said, just from a tax perspective, if you're not doing that inside of a 401k or a self-directed IRA where you have some form of a tax shelter, what is happening from a tax perspective?
What you're describing sounds like someone who's like a trader of stocks, and you start to get away from capital gains, and really everything becomes ordinary income because you're really in the trader business of buying and selling stocks. So capital gains go out the window, and all that churn, all that profit is just ordinary income to you, generally subject to self-employment tax. So you're in one of the least favorable tax methods of making money. The other thing is I've never heard of someone be able to make an infinite return in the stock market, where in real estate you can do that all the time. For example, one of the last projects I did, we bought a couple duplexes for called $1 million. I put 400K into it, and now that it's done, we're refinancing it, paying off the senior lender with a new loan, and I'm putting that $400,000 that I put into it back in my pocket. So I'm into the property for $0, and I'm going to be getting at least $4,000 a month for the rest of my life, for the rest of the time I own that. And so how do you compare that kind of investment structure to a stock return that's paying 6%? Well, I'm getting, $4,000 a month, call it 50K a year on no money in. That's an infinite return, as Ken McElroy likes to say.
Yeah. And this is the thing, what people do not understand how to use debt. There's a lot of people in the Christian community that put all debt in one bucket, and it's called the bad bucket. And that's not true. There's productive debt. And I think a lot of people, as we're recording this in 2025, are looking at Donald Trump and some of his policies. And I'm not here to shill for Donald Trump. I'm not here to criticize him. But I'm saying, as a real estate guy, one thing I can tell you, and I've studied him for a long time, because way before he was a politician, he was a real estate guy. And I was co-hosting a radio show about that. In fact, I've interviewed him twice. I've been in a press room with him and asked him a question. So I'm not going to say I had to sit down with him, but it was pretty cool when he became president. I had this picture of me with Donald Trump before he was, the controversial Donald Trump. He was just the quintessential real estate guy. But the idea of being able to force equity. I think that's where I want to go with this. I don't want to go down the Donald Trump story, but we talked about him with his tax strategy. But what a lot of people don't understand about real estate is the ability to create equity and create it very, very quickly. And I had a chance to sit with George Ross, who was his attorney for 45 years. We were driving him from Manhattan out to his home in Long Island after a conference where we spoke together. And he drove us by Grand Central Station. It was Trump's first real estate deal. It was a rehab. He made $180 million on his first deal. He was 27 years old. He forced equity, and he turned that into, a whole bunch of other stuff. But I want to hone in on this idea. When you buy an income producing property, I want to talk about how income becomes equity.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. So on the example I just did, you say, hey, I bought this thing for $1 million and now I'm pulling all my money out. How did I do that? Well, we forced equity, to your point. And when we bought the thing, let's say rents were about $6,000 a month. Now that we're done with it, we've added a lot more bedrooms. We've reconfigured the plan. It was really under market rents before, but we're going to be getting about $15,000 a month in rent. And so in the world of finances, people finance based on cash flow. People buy real estate based on a capitalization rate, like how much yield can I get out of what I'm buying? So if you increase the yield, you increase the price. And to say another way, you increase the cash flow, you increase the value because people generally buy assets to get something out of them. And in real estate, they're almost always buying for cash flow. People say, oh, do you buy for real estate or do you buy for appreciation or do you buy for cash flow? If you really focus on cash flow, the appreciation will come. People often think, oh, I'm investing for appreciation because I'm buying a beach house in California, and like, oh, I'm just going to hold it for the appreciation. That is really going to be a liability over the near term.
Yeah. So, I just want to jump in because this is such a huge point. If you have a piece of property and you're valuing the equity by the income, and the income goes up and the equity goes up, that's called real equity. If you have a piece of property that is not generating income, or the price goes up, but the rental income does not go up, that is called inflation or potentially fake equity. And so when you see what would happen in housing in 2008, this was people who were using lower and lower and lower interest rates to take the same payments and pay a higher price. And so it's very important when you're doing an analysis to make sure that the equity is a derivative of the income. And you use cap rate, and I know technically that's the way all investors look at it, but I know for the layperson it's confusing. So I'm going to give you a very simple way to do it using what's called a gross rent multiplier. If a property is selling for 10 times its gross income and you're generating, say, $10,000 a month of income on a little apartment building, then that would be $120,000 a year. If it's selling for 10 times gross, property's worth $1.2 million. If you were able to increase the rents to, say, $20,000 a month, now the property would be $2.4 million. You created $1.2 million in equity. That's phase one. So when you can buy a property that is underperforming or in an appreciating area where the supply-demand dynamic allows the real estate rents to go up, you're going to get a little bit of a bump in the income, but you could get 10x or more in your equity growth. Yeah, right. Am I getting that right,
Yeah.
James? Okay.
Yeah, I didn't quite follow the math there, but like it follows. Yeah, I missed
Well, so $10,000 a month is $120,000 a year, and times 10 is $1.2 million.
Yep.
If you took that same property and doubled the income to $20,000 a month, now it's $240,000 a year, and times 10 is 2.4 million. You've created 1.2 million in equity simply by increasing the income by $120,000 a year.
Yep.
Right. And so once you understand that basic concept, then you realize, okay, now I can take that extra income and I can do a cash out refinance on the new equity and pull my cash back out again to go buy another property and repeat the process and get what you call an infinite return, or really goose the return, because the equity that you've left in the property is much smaller relative to the gains, right? And then when you marry that to the tax deduction, so you're going to get the equity back on the cash out refi, you're going to get the tax deductions, then you're going to go purchase a new property and get a new set of tax deductions. This is how real estate investors bring their income down to zero. It's how they create net worth very big, very fast. And you can't do these things with stocks. What you're doing when you buy a stock is you're hoping you buy the next NVIDIA or the next whatever the hot stock is. So I know a lot of people like to do the stock market because it's sterile, it's clean. But if you really understand what I call Main Street investing versus Wall Street investing, Wall Street can't touch Main Street, but you have to know how to do it. It's not just buying the property and managing the property. It's managing the finances of the property, which is both debt and taxes. And I know you know how to do that because you do that.
Yeah. And you really have control over building your wealth instead of abdicating that control to a board of directors or a CEO of a company. And you actually have real ownership. Everyone likes to say, like, oh, I'm an owner of Microsoft or I'm an owner of NVIDIA. Try walking into their corporate headquarters like, hey, I'm an owner here, guys. Open the doors for me. It's not going to work. When you actually own the real estate, you own the keys, you have the keys, you can go walk into your own property. So it's just kind of a mentality shift to think about ownership in that way as well.
Yeah. And when you come back to the civic responsibility of creating amenities or supporting the infrastructure of your local community, when you pay tax, you're supposed to be paying for the freeways and the whatever the services are. But this is the reason the tax code is written the way it is, or at least the way I understand it, is you're incentivized to create housing.
Yes.
You're incentivized to create more real estate in a community. So if you feel like you have a moral conflict with bringing your taxes down to zero, you're not supporting your local community. What I think we're trying to say, James, is that if you use the tax code the way we're talking about it, the only way you get the tax breaks is by creating amenities that actually make you wealthy. You make your neighborhood wealthy, you make yourself wealthy, and you end up not funding what I would, my personal opinion is a little bit of an out of control government who spends money on immoral things. And so I just wanted to bring that to the Christian capitalist community to understand. If you're a Christian out there and you don't understand starting a business, then start to look into it. Learn how to start a business, even a side hustle. I think the other takeaway is get your children involved and learn
Yes.
how to create more tax-free family income at the same time you're mentoring your children and being productive citizens. And then take a look at really using real estate in particular as a way to create equity, to create tax deductions, and further bring your income down while you're doing your civic duty of creating amenities on Main Street. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a win-win-win all the way around the way I look at it.
Well, that's why I love working with you, because not every CPA out there is actually a business owner beyond their firm. And not every CPA out there is an active real estate investor. And so when I found you, I felt like I found a unicorn. I got a guy who's young and his practice is growing. That's great. A guy who is a Christian, who understands the worldview that I'm coming from and what I'm doing, and also understands real estate. And when I heard that you were a Ron Paul fan, I went, okay, I think we're going to get along great. So James, tell me just, I know you've got a newsletter. Tell us a little bit about your newsletter, and if people decide to sign up for it, what are they going to get?
They're going to get, timely updates of what's going on in the taxes. They're going to be getting, onto my list and sharing my thoughts of different structures or strategies I've seen out there. We'll go into some like case studies or wins that I've achieved for other clients. And it's a great way to just, if you don't have any other way of getting tax news, it's a great way to sign up and just kind of feel a little bit more in the know of what's going on.
Okay, I'm going to give you guys a couple of actions. One, if you send an email to Stonehan, 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 that's the name of James' firm, Stonehan at thechristiancapitalist.com. We'll get you information on James, and especially I'll get you subscribed to his newsletter, which you can always unsubscribe if you don't like it. But I hope after listening to this, you're like, you know what? I think I need this. I need to figure that out. I'm recruiting James to be a mentor in our investor mentoring club where you have access to him. So I'm pretty sure I can strong arm him to do that. And so we can get you more information about that. If you have any questions about this episode, if there's anything that we've talked about that's confused you, that you'd like more clarity on, or even that you disagree with, whether it's a spiritual or moral issue, or you think we misspoke on some strategy, let us know. It's all good. We want your feedback, good, bad, or ugly. Just send an email to feedback at thechristiancapitalist.com. I read every single one of them. We'll do our best to respond to them. I can't promise, but we definitely want to know what you're thinking, and we will create additional content. James is going to be a regular contributor to the show. So if you ask me questions, I will ask him. If you call him and ask him questions, he's going to charge you, but he doesn't charge me. So you can ask your questions through me. And but do make sure that you get on his newsletter list, Stonehan, STONEHAN at thechristiancapitalist.com. James, thanks so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to doing a lot of great things for Main Street with you.
Yeah, likewise, Russell. Thanks for having me on.
All right, you take care.